An enemy prepares on the border of your country. You find yourself as one of a small number who pay close attention to this threat as it consumes its neighbours with terrifying efficiency. You look at your own country and, although mighty, you find it wanting, too immersed in internal bickering and minor politicking. Perhaps worse, years of greater fear for internal pressures, peers and voters rather than anything more core to the functioning of the state, have left them blind to the danger, and with a drastically perverted set of priorities. You do your best to convince them of the error, but ultimately any concessions are far below what would be necessary to combat the threat. Even when strategic opportunities arise, the political body is much more interested in internal squabbling than combating the threat. And so, slowly at first, but then much quicker than anyone could respond to, despite all the signals that you try to alert them to, your country's fall from greatness is complete. This is the plight of Demosthenes, of Athens, during Philip of Macedon's subjugation of Greece, and one version of democracy's greatest flaw, its inability to respond to crises. It need not play out this way. Sometimes it's overaction, or action when none is required. It could be a natural disaster or a severe economic downturn or shock. It could even be an incorrect assessment that results in an appropriate response, but gives a false positive of sorts, which leads to improper responses further down the line. When certain passions are invoked, democratic representative bodies are unable to make reasoned decisions, and fall prey to the most appealing sounding solution proposed. Such was the altar on which Rome sacrificed around 1/10 of its adult male population during the Battle of Cannae, when elections during wartime elected overconfident advocates of direct confrontation with Hannibal, who was more than happy to lead them into a slaughter, as he had already done twice before. This might be at least somewhat more forgivable if it was not an exact contravention with the advice and policy of Fabius, who, both before and after the battle, pursued the successful strategy of avoiding confrontation. They had no excuse to throw away those tens of thousands of lives, but did so anyway through their votes, because their passions had brought out the worst in them. Another similar phenomenon is that of disillusionment with the standard political mechanisms and establishment, causing large sections of the electorate to seek almost any alternative which can provide an answer, regardless of the accuracy of their diagnosis and prescription, of course. An acute version of this is found in Venezuela, when decades of instability and rolling crises led to a revolutionary socialist party forming a government. They promised popular democracy, economic independence, equitable distribution of revenues, and an end to political corruption, and achieved the opposite of every point. 20 years on from their popular ascent to power, Venezuela, particularly its economy, is in a state equivalent to a war zone, being ruled over practically as the fief of a Stalin-esque Maduro who, along with other high-level party members, seemed to be overtly bleeding what is left of the country's wealth for personal gain. Of course, this is one of the most egregious examples, but a similar trend can be observed in many other countries, even at the time of writing in many European countries, with the political centre collapsing. Regardless of my own personal feelings on the merits of the emerging political forces, many of these movements have been suggesting essentially the same policies for their entire political lives. Considering the world situation is not so different from 10 years ago, one of two things must be true. Either these democratic systems have been vastly substandard in achieving suitable policy, or they are incapable of swaying the electorate from pleasant falsities. Both options are quite damning. And so to the real meat of the issue. Because the overarching reason why both of those previous options are not only possible, but probable, is because the incentives for each actor in the system are distinct from the good of the government, quite often. But more worrying, so too, the good of the nation, regardless of which definition of nation we use. In a representative democratic system, the politician must acquire a majority of voters to remain in power, at each election. Thus anyone who does not or cannot take part in elections can be relatively safely discounted. Additionally, any policies which cannot be used to gain votes within the time frame generated by the incumbent terms will be regarded as either non-essential or detrimental if the cost is immediate but the payout more long-term. The reverse is also true, where policies that are long-term damaging but immediately popular or short-term beneficial will be preferred. Finally, the interests of numerically greater groups are disproportionately favoured. Many of these also apply to direct democracies, and have been discussed previously, but representative democracies have the additional dubious distinction of requiring the representatives to consider their own interests as a balancing factor. Political parties add yet another consideration, so that in the end, each issue must be weighed against the constituent voters' interests, opportunities for advancement and power within the party, opportunity to raise their profile either nationally or with a particular courted group, and personal feelings on an issue, which may include specialist knowledge perhaps contradicting constituents and party desires. This is all assuming zero corruption, though that is a moral term and thus somewhat hazy to determine objectively. An example on this line, that will be another consideration, is the representative plans past their political career, which must necessarily be taken into consideration. If they are trained and experienced in a particular industry, they may want to return to it, which will influence their decision with respect to it, even without any lobbying or pseudo-bribes being necessary. The relevance of all these factors will ebb from time to time, depending on the prominence of the representative, the point in their term, and the nature of the issue. And of course all of this is subject to individual deviations. These are incentives, not absolute rules after all. Though on this latter point particularly, individuals can exhibit institutionally disincentivized behaviour due to personality. It is worth stepping back for a moment though, and reflecting on the fact that even in the best case scenario of the system working how it's romantically portrayed as working, each constituency population will choose between them a set of representatives that are closest to themselves in beliefs. Even an absolute majority in each constituency must form a government of at least 50% of representatives, so we are down to 25% of constituents relevant to dictating the government which the country gets. Now reduce that to the active constituents, and the numbers will likely be a little over half of the constituents. These representatives then govern in complete accordance with the wishes of their voters, and each new issue that arises is consulted on and voted on accordingly. The outcomes are still entirely dictated by the perfect information available to the voters, the perfect information available to the representatives, and the interests of the voters which are themselves acting rationally, of course. This leads to perhaps the deepest problem, that even though all of these items may be present, which in the real world they are clearly not, the state becomes a form of commons to be exploited, with no definitive responsible actor. Only ever a placeholder subject to forces often external to their own abilities. The Prime Minister will often have very little definitive idea of whether they will keep their role well into the counting of the votes on election night. Such outcomes can almost entirely be determined by factors outside of their own control, or causes so obscure in their relationship to effect that for predictive purposes it may as well be random from their perspective. Something as simple as a bad picture or headline can scupper their chances at election without their realising, as is suggested to have happened to Ed Miliband in the 2015 UK general election. So with this in mind, politicians, and particularly leaders, have an indeterminate time to achieve whatever pet projects animate them, balanced with the need to fulfil their promises, usually these two are tied together, and maintain a good image, on top of all the other influencing factors mentioned earlier, with a much extended list depending on how imperfect the system is, as campaign funders and interest groups exert varying degrees of power by system. Much the same sorts of motivations affect other representatives as well, however. In a manufacturing-dominated constituency, for example, securing tariffs, subsidies, or any number of other similar policies to preserve the viability of the firms and thus the employment of the voters, or perhaps regulations stipulating improvements in working conditions, will take precedence far beyond the viability of these policies in a national context. Similarly, from an individual voter's perspective, there are near infinite benefits to be extracted from the state through votes, and no consequences to suffer for doing so. But when these universal individual interests are combined, the state is bled for immediate benefit by everyone capable of doing so, and policy becomes an incoherent mess of concessions to various groups based largely on manifested influence. So if it were ever in question why the south of England tends to be favoured in policy, why Scottish citizens receive free university education while the rest must pay, or why London continually receives vastly more infrastructure funding than the rest of the UK, this is why. Sometimes these policies coincide with sensible policy, but this is merely coincidental. It is not even that such a decentralised method of decision-making is a bad model. Command economies have been repeatedly demonstrated to be vastly inferior through the repeated failure of socialist, or communist, colloquially, economies, and the inherent fragility of Bronze Age civilizations. But the apparatus of state, as we have formed it, is a unified entity with absolute and singular decision-making capability, and no ability to protect its own interests from those controlling it. So deciding on its direction by explicitly asking people, at a fixed point in time when everyone must decide, with minimal cost to vote, functionally infinite benefits to gain through it, and no marginal additional consequences to face regardless of the outcome for participation, this must be one of the worst ways of dictating policy possible. These qualities are all in stark contrast to the market, which functions in the opposite fashion on almost every point, with vastly superior outcomes by most metrics, though still short of perfect, if such a thing even exists. This is all to conclude that democratic government, even as it exists conceptually without all of the muck of reality distorting it, is incapable of sensible and coherent policy, except for ideologically driven movements, of course, though these would fall within the category of individuals making decisions against rationally incentivized motivations, because they provide all-encompassing worldviews and models of reality that distort a simple perception of the world as it appears to be. Though as a caveat, it's highly debatable whether any part of society even exists without the tint of some ideological framing or another, and yes, I do include this critique potentially. Although, there are some tempering elements to the described incentives and processes, as the extent of exploitation can only extend as far as to rouse ire from otherwise inert parts of society, or persuade unsure voters. Any seemingly corrupt policy which is pushed through can serve as a smear against the government, and a rallying call to the opposition. Likewise, the media landscape has a lot to say about the direction of policy, and will be increasingly vocal as policy moves further and further from the interests and views of the relevant staff, or simply from justifiability. Most first-world democratic systems have these constraints relatively well honed, but elsewhere this is not the case. Elections in parts of the Caribbean and much of Africa are treated as life-and-death affairs, with murders occurring based on voting intentions, a phenomenon we are ourselves accelerating towards, because there is less oversight, and a very present knowledge that their well-being is overtly dictated by the outcome. This would be, of course, to suggest that this limiting power is virtuous, which it most certainly is not, and ever less so. It is no less vicious itself in its mechanisms, but its constraining effects are an appreciated byproduct nonetheless. There is one element that is worthy of praise, however, as a contingent does exist in the voter base that maintains a genuine concern for proper policy, as distinct from those who would use such concerns as a cudgel to beat their opponents, without ever acting on such a concern while in power. Ironically, in all likelihood, these voters will often abstain in all but the most obviously detrimental issues, as a conservative humility would logically be the company to a genuine desire to see the country thrive as much as possible. Of course, let's not forget that fanatical pragmatism could almost be considered a sort of soft oxymoron. These are, however, many of the roused voters who would revolt against obviously exploitative policy, or a status quo which is plainly unsatisfactory. While there is much more that could be discussed on these issues, to even do the subjects already covered some respectable justice, this topic will need to be returned to, but it may serve as an outline. In conclusion, democracy, as we currently understand and practice it, may well be one of the worst systems possible, only surpassed by a democracy totally subservient to ideological constructs, civil war, irrational or insane dictatorship, and likely a few others. Being that it is clearly not the worst of all possible outcomes, it can have its applications, but not as a defining characteristic or axiomatic underpinning.